Hello, welcome to DavChat, hosted by DavCat43, my Twitter handle, my website name, and my YouTube account. If you find yourself at any point enjoying this broadcast, please feel free to click a button that allows you to retweet it or send it out on social media. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the broadcast. I'm an Australian housewife with a strong interest in American politics as it progresses in a fairly predictable descent into fascism, but with a nice American resistance twist. We have some protests. Imagine if this had been able to happen in Nazi Germany. People out on the streets waving torches saying, you know, the people that you've been dehumanizing, they matter. And we are here to stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. And our numbers have swelled in response to state-ordered suppression. And when I say state, I mean federal government level state, not the individual state of Portland, Oregon. So let's have a small, tiny listen to this crowd. What are they chanting? This is footage that has had 1.3 million views. And they're saying, uh-oh. As a Jewish person whose relatives were slain by the government in the Holocaust during World War II, I find it so heartening that at this point in human history, people are perceiving the need to stand up for each other and to recognize the escalating nature of a government that has been emboldened by its willingness to persecute others, that has been reactionary in its embrace of people who felt aggrieved, who were brainwashed that they were being badly done by, that they were being oppressed because the government was favoring Black people and that they weren't worthy of being favored, which was bollocks. White people receive government benefits just as much as Black Americans do, but habits of racism persist. Mental habits of dismissing the value and the worth of others dies hard, as has slavery, because the 13th Amendment has a loophole that allows incarcerated people to have their labor exploited, and mass prisons have been built in the US with people arrested to fill quotas of people whose then enslaved labor benefits corporations that lack the scruples to not capitalize on this state organized slavery. So hi, Paul. Hi, Twitty Cake. Nice to see you all. I'm going to go over a few things tonight, but I use the term demented fascist in the title because once again, I felt comfortable using the term fascist. There was a while there on social media where I didn't feel comfortable talking about Trump as a fascist just because I kind of noticed that the other people, mainly referring to Trump as a fascist, were Bernie bros, and I was quite scared that they were going to sabotage the 2020 election by insisting that the truth that they were wedded to, their truth, that Bernie Sanders was broadly popular, was in fact a misperception that they were going to insist on and consequently sabotage the election results, much in the same way that they failed and refused to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. People who should be allies of the Democratic Party, people who claim to want to help the impoverished, who claim to want to reduce suffering amongst America, class-based suffering, race-based suffering, etc., but wouldn't vote for a female candidate who had very strong progressive credentials and a very strong history of advocating for Black Americans. Yes, so Trump certainly is a fascist. Thank you, Clive, for liking the video on YouTube. Much appreciated. Sometimes I acknowledge the trolls, but at the moment their comments have more of a comic effect. Like imagine trying to claim that President Trump has made these arduous times easier. I think Trump is falling so significantly in popularity in different demographic groups across America, not because failing the public the first time in his initial response to coronavirus, people were still prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt there. His white pass covered that incredible betrayal of the American public. But then his ongoing refusal to deal with reality and to respond appropriately, to make good on the fact that he receives federal tax dollars or that he has the power to activate forces that only the president has, that he is supplied by forces paid for by billions of dollars of American taxpayer money, that supplies him with intelligence community reports and organizations which supply him with sophisticated medical advice, that it has people who read research from around the world and process it and adapt their conclusions, their public health strategies to the most up-to-date research of the moment. And he dismisses all of that. And what I am campaigning is not the politicization of a crisis, but rather the campaign gamification of the crisis. So when you're not trying to solve a problem, you're just trying to manipulate news cycles on a daily basis for whatever you think is favorable to your campaign at that point in time, that is what's occurred. Trump has tried to campaignify the crisis by taking a contrarian point of view to whatever scientists told him, because typically Democrats would align with scientific positioning on the crisis. So Trump had to be in opposition to that. Trump had to magnify the economic crisis because it was useful to him in a campaign sense, because it covered up the magnitude of the economic crisis initiated by Trump with his ill-advised, misbegotten, crazy trade war that he instigated with China, with other American trading partners, by starting a tariff escalation. So yes, Trump has certainly done very little to make these arduous times easier, because he has in fact done everything possible to make them more difficult, to conceal the extent of the crisis, to hide from American state governors what he was being told in his intelligence briefings, because anything that's not relevant to his campaign is irrelevant to him. The health and well-being of the American public is irrelevant to Trump. The economy, the health and well-being of the economy is irrelevant to Trump if it doesn't fit into a story that he can tell the public about how great he is and how terrible his opponents are. So everything is grist to his mill of self-promotion. That is his only talent, constructing an artifice, a mythology about himself. In terms of actual competent management or intelligent response to anything or processing information appropriately, none of that. He processes what he needs to do to try and manipulate the media to represent him in a favorable light. And it doesn't work all the time. And it especially doesn't work when a pandemic changes people's reality. Because Trump can control the media cycle on Fox. Trump can control the media cycle on any Sinclair-owned news station, because he is in their pocket and they are in his pocket. That's a symbiotic, exploitative relationship to weaponize the gullibility of various stratas of the American public in accordance with their most racist and anti-government impulses. Dogmatic anti-government impulses. Stupid, misguided, racist anti-government principles, because all of those people who claim to just have an ideology that rejects big government and taxes, those are people who are very much driven, whether they will admit it or not, by the compulsion to withhold services and educational systems and infrastructure from people they deem to be less worthy than themselves. People who they have relegated to a lower rung of an arbitrarily and racistly devised hierarchy of cultural background and skin color, to say that we award ourselves extra merit purely by virtue of being white. and we'll talk about how great Western civilization is as if we personally are responsible for it. We'll defend Western civilization as if it's our own achievement. We'll defend fossil fuels and deride climate science as if it's our achievement that fossil fuels ever managed to be developed and help humanity for a while have the gift of energy that seemed to come with relatively little consequences. Only we now know it does come with very significant consequences. It imperils our future. It imperils our children's future. It imperils all of it much more closely than we think. So people's positivity bias and people's normalcy bias is in significant play at the moment, when you can see how resistant people are to the reality of an escalating COVID crisis and the reality of an economy that's likely to hit a brick wall sooner rather than later as a consequence of people staying indoors, people spending less, when the evidence of an out-of-control pandemic is before them. So Trump can control Fox and Sinclair, or they can mutually control each other, but he can't stop news from getting out about overcrowded hospitals turning people away because their ICU beds are filled. Trump cannot stop people from finding out from their daily lives that their schools are closed and that their businesses had to close because hospitals were clearly in such danger, and responsible elected local officials could perceive that danger outside of the Fox network's repeated deriding of the danger. So that's at play, that America has a very significant subsection of voters that few people talk about, because people report on politics as if it's a two-horse race. There's a third party. You could even say there's a third and a fourth party. The third party is independents, people who try and remove themselves from party affiliation and party loyalties because they want to reserve judgment and base their votes on circumstances they can see in front of them. So in 2016, James Comey was giving those independent voters a message of Hillary Clinton is so problematic we had to reopen an investigation into her. It'd be great if he'd come clean about how he was bullied into doing that, which people have hinted that he was, because of pro-Trump elements in the New York Police Department that were cooperating with Rudy Giuliani to leak the fact that there were emails from Hillary Clinton on Huber Abedin's computer that had been seized because Anthony Weiner had used it to sexually interact with a young child, a 15-year-old girl. Oh, that's nice. Some boogaloos have just been arrested, or you sent me an article about it. I'm pleased to hear it. At least Biden is hearing the same intelligence briefings as Trump is now. That's nice. And Eric Swalwell has said that he heard some classified information that he thinks needs to be shared with the public, because he thinks the information that's been put out about lots of people interfering with the election is misleading, in that they mostly have information about one nation interfering with the election, and it's a misdirect to tell people, oh, all of these countries, like, don't really worry about it. So many people are trying to interfere with the American election. It all kind of counterbalances out in the wash. Holly is talking about a video I posted of a woman being evicted. And it's so important to watch videos like that, because there's an empathy deficit that we're working to minimize. Having realized that ignoring that empathy deficit and ignoring those disinformation pools in American life white ants the whole society. And when I say white ants, I mean quietly undermines while nobody's really paying attention. It would be great if white privileged trolls listened to me, but at the same time, I don't expect them to learn anything from me, because people have a cognitive architecture. Well, cognitive furniture is a great way of describing it. They have a belief system with legs. The legs are something they heard on Fox, and something they heard on Sinclair, and something they heard on Facebook, which promotes group membership in groups like the Boogaloo group. 60% of people who joined Boogaloo groups on Facebook did so because Facebook's algorithms promoted those Boogaloo accelerationist second Civil War groups. They promoted them on that goddamn unprincipled murder for hire website. And yes, we'll cover that soon, that the Sinclair network. I often talk about Fox and its effect on American society, but Sinclair stations, and that's an owner that owns a mass of different small stations around the United States that people just trust. That's their local news. And they don't know, they might not have heard about how it's worse than Fox. I think the motivation for the Bernie Bros to sabotage the Democratic Convention falls as the number of American dead continues to mount. So their motivation for trying to hurt American society is less when American society becomes more visibly already hurting. So the Bernie Bros sabotaging things in 2016 was because society seemed fairly impervious to its own ills. American society was running along fine, and people like Susan Sarandon were saying, well, maybe a revolution could be good because then people will really wake up. And she's got her own way, but I don't think people would applaud her for promoting that trajectory of human activity, for saying, let's vote for Trump, or let's not vote for Hillary Clinton because she's just as bad as Trump. And if we get Trump, then we'll get a revolution and that'll be great. There's a lot of dead people that have helped wake people up for the need to take a stand to safeguard Black lives. And even now, Trump's still refusing to deal with a pandemic that costs a disproportionate number of Black lives. But Trump's getting enough electoral pushback in the form of falling voter approval rates that he's starting to say, well, I have to maybe talk a little more as if I'm addressing the problem rather than ignoring the problem, which is a painful concession for him to make, because admitting he's doing something new carries the inherent implication that he didn't do something right before, that it's an inherent admission that the crisis is real. Yes, Trump has destroyed multiple American institutions, but not irredeemably. And it is very bad that Americans pay the salary of Attorney General William Barr, who has perverted the Department of Justice, that people have been appointed to the Supreme Court that make decisions that negatively impact American population groups, and will probably make some more bad decisions between now and the election. But they were already making bad decisions. Corporations already had too much control over American political life before Trump arrived on the scene. So Trump is a product as well as a symptom of rot and white-anting of American institutions by Republicans, by conservative politicians who worked very hard on political virtue signaling and just amplifying the far left, so that to consumers of conservative media, they seemed like the entire Democratic Party. Your Bernie Bros, socialists, and your people who are so outraged by the disproportionate ability of corporations to buy legislation and to buy the loyalty of politicians. Their outrage about that has made some people convinced that they're communists who just want to take everything you have and then redistribute it evenly. Redistribution to many people sounds like theft, and in a just society, it's not theft, it's called investing in people's potential, not pursuing communism where you say, yes, nobody must have anything more than anyone else, and we will have a large, centralized, totalitarian bureaucracy to ensure that happens, and that none of you gets ahead of yourselves, and that we don't have too large a wealth gap. What's it called? Income gap? Income inequality. So people say, look, we don't care about inequality if the alternative is communism, because we know communism kills millions of people. and that intention of imposing perfect systems of justice and equality on a population always end up in massive oppression and a corrupt central bureaucracy and personality cults of leadership and famines, often incredible, large man-made famines that kill millions of people. Yes, Alan is right. Hello, Alan. It is time to boycott advertisers on Sinclair, so let's start making lists and sharing names and getting specific, because we can be too broad and too self-indulgent in our denunciations of Trump. We have to move beyond Trump and go outwards in that circle of influence and say, who is propping him up? Who is propping up this evident dictator? Yes, it's Trump voters, and they support Republicans, and they've made some Republicans so afraid, not of a negative tweet from Trump, but afraid of losing their voters, because previous Republican politicians were more genteel in their racism and more genteel in how they sold this overly emphatic concept of independence to Americans. Bootstraps, no public services, less public services. Bootstraps is key because character, we're the party that cares about character and independence and hard work. And it was very effective political messaging, but it wasn't entirely true. And therefore, Republicans in power have often overseen economic crashes. Katie Porter questioned the head of Lockheed Martin, which is a weapons manufacturing company. Yes, Republicans failed to win with corporatist leaders who would have reduced regulation similarly to Trump and probably undermined public education as well, but did so in a much more genteel way and at least had some respect for American institutions, as opposed to an outright fascist who then went, I'm happy to bring those Republican values out into the open, to be more explicit in, I blame migrants, I blame Mexicans. Let's be more brazen, let's be more honest about our real motivations here. We are suspicious of migrants. We suspect that they're taking things from us. We deny the reality that migrants contribute more than they take from America. We deny the reality that prisons are overfull of unjustly over-targeted and over-policed Black Americans. Yes. So yes, God bless Portland, indeed. So Lockheed Martin were asking for relief, but profits were up 15%. Well, Katie Porter is supposed to be known for her hardcore questioning and her relentless and non-deferential attitude towards CEOs. I'm just noting the Wall Street Journal has published an article about day trading, how everyone's a day trader now. And I still want to draw your attention to it because people home from work and people with too much free time are trading stocks, putting their money in the stock market and helping create a bubble that will increase the severity of the crash once reality catches up to this little corrupt grift bubble that Trump and Elon Musk and to a degree a complicit Federal Reserve Board have going for it. A Federal Reserve Board with too many Trump appointees that has been too pressured by the relentlessness of Trump tweeting negatively about their actions. Now, this is the Sinclair Broadcast Group that is going to air on local television stations across America. Something that's going to air on the weekend is a conspiracy theory that suggests Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top expert on infectious diseases, was responsible for the creation of the coronavirus. Lordy. So here's Judy Mitkowitz, who's a researcher who was, I think, sort of kicked out of her university and kicked out of her profession for professional misconduct. So instead, she's just developed a frown that continues all the way down towards her chin and she created a professionally produced looking video, I've heard, called Plandemic, which says, yep, the virus is real. So you can project onto it whatever you want. The virus is real. The virus has been orchestrated by humans. So it'll stop on the day after the election. It'll stop on November the 4th because it's just something that has been summoned into existence to oppress you. I'm sure all manner of people conclude on the motivations of why this would be done. Why Anthony Fauci would create a virus. Oh my God, these people who produce this content and these people who believe the content. So Sinclair has a lot of stations that aren't just Fox affiliates, but CBS, ABC, and NBC too. Is that true? Does Sinclair own NBC? Does Sinclair own ABC and CBS? Because that's extraordinary. People don't understand that the local affiliate stations they've trusted for 30 years are now owned by far-right propagandists. NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, it's all the same. Well, that would be the answer to everybody who ever says, how can Trump still have an approval rating of 37% or 39%? It's going down because reality is contradicting the manufactured propaganda so insistently and to an increasing degree across the United States. And I've been saying since approximately April the 22nd that surveys show that independent voters who know someone with the coronavirus, who know an infected person, have an on average 15% drop in their approval rating of Donald Trump relative to the group of independent voters who don't know anybody who has the coronavirus. So that's a significant difference, and it's a function of who knows someone, whose reality contradicts Trump's reality too sharply, whose reality too sharply contradicts propaganda reality from Sinclair, from Fox, etc. And this is a video that was produced to highlight the propaganda nature of Sinclair. So have a listen.
Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities, the El Paso, Las Cruces communities, Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about troubling, irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 So I'd love to help pay for that ad to be shown at a national level, because once people are aware that they're being manipulated, they become more on the alert for it. Americans don't like to be taken for fools, but if you can highlight some of the insidious methodology, you don't have to tell them, hey, you've been given the wrong facts. I've got the right facts for you, because that just sets you up as a source that they don't trust compared to their trusted sources. But if you highlight how their trusted sources, their trusted local faces are being given scripts that are exactly the same to repeat across the nation, that is suspicious behavior, and that is something that can put people on the alert without you giving them an alternate set of facts to believe that you might know of highly validated, substantiated facts, but they have already internalized the furniture of a whole different set of facts with legs on it because they've heard it from these people on a nightly basis. Please share on Twitter. Will do. Who is the judge that denied protecting the Portland protesters? He was someone appointed by John Roberts to a FISA court. So I don't know their name. But yes, I will cheerfully, I think I have retweeted it on Twitter, but I will check. Nope, I haven't. Okay. I'm retweeting it now, so you can check that out if you want. Look at the headline that's going to be on the Sinclair station. This what's it called? The thing at the bottom of the screen. That, oh, let me make it bigger for you so you can see it. It's going to say, did Dr. Fauci create COVID-19? And that's going to be a message. You'd hope that people would reject that, but it's just going to give people who are gullible an extra plank in to magnify their tendency to disengage from reality and despise Democrats. But remember, that is a substantial amount of the American population. That is 30%. But for the purposes of an election, independent voters who don't take this as gospel, who don't take Sinclair information as gospel, who are more likely to have a broader media diet because they view themselves as independent voters, they are the 40% that is key for this election. And every new independent voter who knows somebody infected begins to change their mind. So it's not spotty for you, but it's spotty for Alan. I'm sorry to hear that there are problems. Chiron, yes, that's it. Chiron at the bottom of the page. Thank you so much. What are you arguing that Biden and the DNC need to respond to the failure to protect the protesters in Portland? Yes. Well, the great thing about those protests is that they're being joined by more and more people. So the Wall of Mums has been, the Wall of Mums has been joined by the Dad Pod, and now a wall of vets and purple-clad lawyers for Black Lives Movement. And there was somebody else as well. Dad's in orange, Mum's in yellow, vets just wearing things that indicate that they are vets and holding their hands behind their back, standing to attention. We'll check some of that footage. Let's check this out. This is a little bit startling, so just a warning. It's 15 seconds of footage.
I'm a black woman. What are you doing? What are you doing?
Watching it again. Ready? Watch this.
I'm a black woman. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Leave them alone. Leave them alone. Only one with the real gun is the one that's going to You are the threat. You are the threat.
Watch again.
I'm a black woman. What are you doing?
He's picking up his gun with a,
What are you doing?
that's a heavy duty weapon. And her words are, I'm a black woman. And then he's doing this, aiming at somebody behind her. She says, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then she begins to point at them and say, you are the threat. You are the threat. And, you know, aside from some graffiti, which isn't particularly violent, and some fires started on the street, which do involve property damage and are a little bit anarchical, Americans have been emboldened to join a movement to support other protesters to protect their First Amendment rights. They're putting their bodies on the line to, in a show of solidarity, to say this is not okay. America has protected speech and protected political speech. So it doesn't mean that they're endorsing graffiti or endorsing any crimes by a subset of the protesters. They're saying graffiti does not collectively revoke the right of protesters to protest. And armed guards or army-looking soldiers that say police on them but have no identifying insignia for their names, who are therefore much less accountable to the public, that's not okay to have their presence on the street, amplifying the campaign opportunities for the federal government to claim that they are a law and order party, and that only Trump can restore order. His followers love to talk about balls. Balls is a very particularly favorite topic, and I do some research on social media to back up that assertion. They're always saying Trump has the balls to do this. He's the only one with the balls to do it. And I know the temptation is sometimes there to fight fire with fire. And when Avenatti came on the scene and was quite confrontational, people were like, yes, balls. Balls was what is needed to counter the perception that Trump has balls, and that's how he could run an abortive campaign for presidency, until Avenatti was outed as having defrauded his clients for millions of dollars and attempted to extort Nike. So yes, he had balls, but balls are not what is needed. A calm hand is needed, people prepared to look at the evidence, people prepared to countenance the views of scientists and to try and relate to reality rather than a big positive sounding but fake representation of what America is like. People celebrated Trump's willingness to be a cheerleader for America, but now that people are dying from Trump's insistence on still cheerleading that everything's all right, everything is all right, nothing to see. Hey, do we support that as being a good suggestion for a Lincoln project ad, using footage of Trump describing himself as a cheerleader for America in response to people saying, do you think you might have minimized the pandemic? Do you think you might have minimized the problem a bit? And Trump responding, well, I see myself as a cheerleader for America. They should then superimpose his head on the body of a cheerleader saying, the virus is going away, it's disappearing, haha. And some, overall conclusion of contrasting that with more sober footage of Biden saying, this is what needs to be done. We need to have a plan. We need to use the Defense Production Act to ramp up testing. Just somebody looking like an adult being real with the public and contrasting that in a split screen footage of Trump saying, it's not real. You don't need masks. I think that's freedom, choice for Americans. I'm not going to mandate mask wearing. And everything's great. Paul is saying, please give Dav a thumbs up. Paul saying, did already, no need for reminding me. But yes, to anyone else, if you feel motivated to share this broadcast, feel free. And of course, yes, that's Trump's platform, Con Man for America. He has a much more difficult pathway to the presidency this time around because his campaign is no longer a rhetorical flight of fancy. It's no longer, let's throw the dice and see what happens to America. People can see what has happened to America. And propaganda is very good at blinding people, but not everybody is buying that propaganda. Reality is speaking out very strongly against that propaganda. And because Trump has repeated the offense of minimizing the pandemic, he did it initially, and he's doing it again with his campaign-directed positioning of himself as the cheerleader for reopening. People can see that that is endangering Americans, and it continues to endanger Americans. Everybody is suffering and will suffer in an increasing fashion as cases continue to climb around the United States, particularly in states with Trump-inspired governors who chose to minimize the pandemic following Trump's lead and to force through a reopening of bars and churches and other public events involving lots of people in indoor circumstances with singing, breathing, talking, yelling. Because protracted periods of time of being exposed to people in an indoor setting without the benefits of outdoor air circulation, where you have more of a concentrated opportunity to inhale viral particles from someone else would have viral particles contaminate the membranes on your eyes or enter your nose or your mouth. People are noticing. Hi, Jane. Hi, Jeff. No, at some point, the polls might signify to Trump that footage of mums clad in yellow with mum ponytails and mum love handles getting arrested, getting manhandled, getting gassed by an occupying force that looks like the military, but without their names on their uniforms, that is a bad look even for a government trying to run on law and order. They want to characterize the enemy as being Antifa anarchists, and mums have put their bodies on the line to contradict that propaganda from Trump and to protect the children out there who are young, who are more likely to be idealistic, but who also have First Amendment rights like every resident of the United States. Okay, I'm just going to read you a small extract from a very important book. And people shared this book with me 2 years ago when I published a video describing my family's experience with Nazism and how my great-grandparents died in a death camp, having forced my grandmother to jump from a train and escape from that forced transportation of Jews to camps where they were murdered en masse by industrialized slaughter instigated by a racist, discriminatory regime, a government that was originally democratically elected, but after a while just ended democratic elections, which people fear Trump will do because that is the fascist playbook. And fascists get on a treadmill, what's been described as a fascist treadmill or the dictator's treadmill, and it's hard to get off because dictators tend to be incompetent in terms of rulers. They're just very competent at campaign-directed loyalty. So the ability to encourage people to make a logical misstep of conflating a cult leader, loyalty to a cult leader with loyalty to the country. And once they've convinced enough people, I represent Germany. If you don't like Hitler, you don't like Germany. If you don't like Trump, you don't like America. Once they do that, if they've got enough people on board, then they feel confident to sabotage the apparatus, the institutions of democracy, and just intimidate the people who might have opposed them by saying, look at the fervor of my supporters. But yes, America has not been intimidated by the fervor of Trump supporters. They have derided and disdained them, which wasn't enough. You couldn't just do that because joking about people is too comfortable a way to live. You can say, oh yeah, it's making me feel cynical and sad, so I'm just gonna laugh about it. And that's not a very activist state of mind. We need the activist state of mind, and fascism requires an activist response, but people still want to be effective. So it looks like at this point, the effective thing to do is to counter propaganda by showing yourself as allied in loyalty with Trump's enemies. So nope, those young people that could conceivably be dismissed as Antifa. Antifa just means anti-fascist, but there's been many number of years where Antifa have been demonized in Fox News. So you find people who are completely irrational about the threat posed to society by Antifa when it's not an organization. You'd laugh at it if it was in a Bond movie because it's just some disaffected young people who say things are so bad in America, we better flip the whole system on its head and have something that's a bit more of an approximation of communism. They're often just young people who at least recognize things that are going wrong and are honest about that, even if the solutions that they propose are not always the most pragmatic or well thought out. Doesn't matter. They don't vote in any significant numbers and they're not violent. They come out to defend people from marching neo-Nazis, and they come out and graffiti things as well. And they did start their own little autonomous community in Seattle which was not a good idea. You shouldn't try and expel the police entirely. Joe Biden doesn't want to defund the police. He wants to allocate more funding to police so that they have better training. It would be great if police officers had better training. And I mean, it'd be great if police officers could be asked not to take weapons with them on traffic stops so that less people died at the hands of police for crimes of fear, of highly rational fear of running away from police officers. It shouldn't be okay for police officers to kill people who evade arrest. And in order to make that happen, you have to try and de-escalate that situation in the mind of police officers. You have to say, maybe it's not a crime to resist arrest, provided you're not violent towards a police officer. So it could be still violent, and a crime to attack a police officer, but not violent to just run away. I mean, not a crime to run away. So this is the book. Now that dehumanization of its first internal enemies, Muslim, Black, Hispanic, and LGBT Americans, is accepted by its base, GOP fascism comes for Jewish people. Well, yes, I think GOP fascism has been run very covertly by the fringe elements of GOP loyalists on social media, like the QAnon type of people, because yes, they are neo-Nazis who have encouraged the kind of domestic terrorist events like the shooting up of a synagogue in Pittsburgh. But the white supremacist target for US cleansing is not going to be Jews. It's Muslims, Hispanics, and Black Americans. And look at how much progress they've made with something that's very powerful. It doesn't involve taking guns and putting people in camps. It involves letting masses of Black Americans die from a virus, from preventable deaths that Trump purposefully and willfully failed to address. So Aaron here is recommending a book called They Thought They Were Free, The Germans, 1933 to 1945, by an American journalist called Milton Meyer, who went over to Germany and interviewed people after Hitler. So what happened here was the gradual habituation of the people, little by little, to being governed by surprise, to receiving decisions deliberated in secret, to believing that the situation was so complicated that the government had to act on information which the people could not understand, or so dangerous that if the people could not understand it, it could not be released because of national security. Each step disguised, perhaps not intentionally, as a temporary emergency measure or associated with true patriotic allegiance. Temporary emergency measure to send American federal troops to Democratic-controlled cities, to cities with Democratic mayors. That's an emergency temporary measure. Sending troops to the border where they fired tear gas at migrants, including women and children, and normalized if it's tolerated. That has given the government permission to continue. And their sense of identification with Hitler, their trust in him, made it easier to widen this gap and reassure those who would have otherwise worried about it. So yes, think about all the people who haven't worried that much about what Trump has done because it was just the new normal, and some people like Trump, so, what can you do? Some people like him. You've just got to accept that they won and you lost. But if you ignore that they won by cheating, that they are indebted to a hostile foreign power, that America is being governed by someone who has sidestepped the constitutional protections meant to safeguard the American public from a leader who is not prioritizing American interests because their instincts, their political judgments are compromised by their indebtedness to a hostile foreign power. I should listen back to that sentence and write it down because you don't hear it said enough. You don't hear it said enough why the Constitution made those emoluments clauses. They made them for a reason, to protect America from someone with compromised instincts. You can see how easy it was then not to think about fundamental things. One had no time. The dictatorship and the whole process of its coming into being was above all diverting. It provided an excuse not to think for people who did not want to think anyway. And I'm going to draw your attention to the word diverting there, because Trump is very useful for the Republican Party. And people often talk about, oh, well, what if Trump's just, he's just a clown. So what if they get someone worse afterwards? Trump is the worst because he very much enables the Republican Party to get away with highly unpopular policies without too much pushback from the public, because he just draws everybody into a constant argument about whether or not he's a clown. So Trump is a diversion away from focus on policy and away from focus on cruelty. The Republican Party gets to be cruel in a way that intoxicates. Have you heard of the Sanford prison experiment, where people get assigned roles? University students got to be guards or prisoners, and people just adopted a group identity, and it very much informed their actions. So the guards got increasingly cruel and the prisoners got increasingly disheartened. And it was just a randomly assigned role. It wasn't as if people were selected, like, oh, we'll just pick the cruelest people and make them guards. There was a randomized process of going person 1, guard, person 2, prisoner. But that shows us how institutional systems come into being, institutional patterns of behavior, where you are part of a group. That group has to act in a certain way, and the power dynamics inherent in that position start to inform that person's moral judgments and that person's actions. Your mom wants to go and stand with the protesters. That's awesome. She could go during the day, maybe, although there still could be gassing and that's so beautiful that she wants to. Do you know, it would make an incredible impression. The more elderly people that are there, it really makes a strong statement. So if you felt that you could help her or protect her, let her wear yellow and carry flowers and take her away at any sign of escalation, it would be so powerful. An 84-year-old turning up to show their support. Bob said it's coming, the worst homelessness since the Great Depression. I hope Democrats are quickly in power to try and help remedy that situation, but it's very difficult to undo. Once people are put on the street, it's very difficult to get them back into a home. It's very difficult to get landlords to accept applications from people who can't list a current address. Thank you for your application for this home. Where do you live currently? In my car, because I was evicted, like millions of other people during the COVID crisis. Oh, yeah, thanks, but that's a bit of a gamble. I have the opportunity to rent to someone else who's not currently homeless. Sorry about that. So Terrapin says, my video about my relative still haunts you. Thank you. And Paul is here because he also connected with that video. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. You've been a very steadfast presence in my broadcast and in my social media existence. Trump's ex-wife, Ivana Trump, admitted that Trump kept a copy of Hitler's collected speeches, My New Order, in a cabinet. And Trump confirmed to the journalist that he did have such a book. He lied by saying a Jewish friend gave it to me, but he gave the name of that friend, Marty someone. And the journalist interviewed Marty, and Marty said, yes, I gave Trump that book. I thought it would be interesting to him, but I'm not Jewish. So no, it wasn't given to Trump to be historically interesting. The person who gave it to Trump presumably understood that it had some resonance for him, that Trump would be interested in the speeches of a man who manipulated the public, who used emotion to incite loyalty. Trump's brand is all about gaining schmucks, gaining followers who who donate to him, who give their time, their love, their loyalty to him without any actual realistic basis for doing so. You're in California. Police do get shot at as well. Do they? Where may one contribute? Contribute to what? Yes, Biden wants to give police 300 million towards training. And it would be great if social workers were emboldened and officially paid to attend mental health call-outs, etc. Because too often mental health call-outs are then met with significant police brutality and violence because they're not trained to deal with mental health events. They're trained to deal with the public as a threat to their safety. Yes, American Jews are overwhelmingly lean democratic, and also that margin of favoring the Democratic Party has increased since Trump. The book They Thought They Were Free is a great book, isn't it? No, it's helpful because even independent voters are connecting more with the idea that federal government suppression of the First Amendment rights of protesters is part of a historical playbook of fascism. So people are getting more comfortable with using that term to refer to Trump, and that's okay. We don't have to pussyfoot around it anymore for fear of alienating people and being called hyperbolic. Over 140,000 deaths, and someone who is trying to send children to school out of a campaign-directed motivation to position himself as pro-economy and pro-opening up, but who is revealing himself to be so devoted to his own campaign goals that he is prepared to sacrifice children and their teachers and their communities and consequently the economies of those places as well, by refusing to address the question of how to best contain a virus that is ultimately the main threat to the American economy. It's not lockdowns that threaten the economy, it's an uncontained virus, and that was evident in the United States in 1918 when the flu pandemic of that time was weathered better in an economic sense by cities such as St. Louis, as opposed to Pittsburgh. Is it Pittsburgh? Yes. So you're in California. That wouldn't be easy then for your mother to travel to the Portland protests. There will be protests in California as well, I imagine, that she can join. Troops may come to Los Angeles, exactly. Yes, and the Republican Party is very torn over whether to grant stimulus measures because people like Ted Cruz want to argue that payments to unemployed people will be an inducement to not work. And everybody else will begin to say loudly with one voice, Ted Cruz, you're a moron, if you let millions of Americans fall into homelessness as a consequence of this virus, and the president who has botched and continues to botch and sabotage a response to the virus, then it's not okay to deny those people significant unemployment insurance when they have previously been workers who pay tax. It's not okay to keep punishing people who are unfortunate victims of a crisis that is national. Australians can relate to your politics. In fact, we helped cause a lot of your current political situation by virtue of having a racist society, the most racist product of which, Rupert Murdoch, or the most influentially racist product of which, Rupert Murdoch, moved from Australia to the United States, established Fox News, and has helped with brainwashing a significant proportion of your population into voting against their self-interest, voting for Republican candidates who have continued to white ant American infrastructure, American communities, American institutions, such as public education, public healthcare systems, etc. The Republican Party for a long time has been very motivated to oppose and undermine the hard-won gains of workers and civil rights activists on the behalf of the Black community and Black people in America who built America's foundational wealth, and much of America's wealth follows on from that. Foundational means, the initial bricks of America's wealth, and further layers of bricks have been laid by migrants, which migrants voters are ostensibly groomed by Republicans, but at the same time, migrants are still Democratic leaning. And out of fear of political obsolescence as an entire party, the Republican Party has chosen to embrace cheating, corruption, electoral fraud, a fascist candidate in Trump, all manner of things to reduce the vote, disenfranchise Black Americans, disenfranchise some white Americans as collateral damage in their efforts to gerrymander districts and make voting more difficult for a high number of Americans, and to purge voter rolls repeatedly just to punish people for not having voted in every single election, which they're not legally obliged to do. And the consequence for that should not be purging from the rolls to make it more difficult to vote in the future. Yes, Mary Trump does appear to be very decent and normal. Highly educated, worked hard, got a PhD in, what's that subset of psychology called, where you look at people with very maladaptive behavior? It's like a subset called sociopathology. Can't remember. Australia does have a very similar dynamic. Republican is our Liberal Party and Labor is our Democratic Party. And Rupert Murdoch controls 70% of Australia's print media and a lot of the hearts and minds of the Australian public as well, which creates a similar dynamic of exploitable racism. Which means when the racist beliefs of people in the working or middle class, which is then used to covertly advance the interests of the wealthy classes, which tends to be the wealthy white class. Yes, Tony Abbott was a Republican. He venerated virginity. He said women should give virginity as a gift to their husbands. And just use phrases like the housewives of Australia, as they're doing their ironing, need to understand that, etc. So yes, thanks, Twitty. I'm going to go anyway, so you're not going to miss out on anything. It's time to go from me. Thank you all so much for listening, and please always feel free to visit my Twitter homepage and share the link that gets generated from my Twitter account of this Periscope broadcast. That helps. And yes, anything you want to do to promote my broadcast is helpful if you think my voice would benefit from amplification. Yep. And please feel free to nag me about writing, because I'm trying to nag myself. Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Terrapin. Mark. I don't know anything about the Homeland Security lawsuit for New York. Your liberal media is still highly deferential to conservative politics, in that it will start each day fresh as, so what are people saying today, rather than providing an ongoing of context of what have these confirmed liars said today? Or what's the latest development in this habitual pattern of lying that we've seen from this one political candidate? Documented lying. They leave out a lot of the context. Even though journalists should have a bias towards the truth, they have neglected that plank of journalism in favor of maintaining a fresh as a daisy appearance of clean slateness each day. Good interaction today. I'm glad you liked it, Bob. Thank you. Oh, they backed out of their lawsuit. That's a shame. Let's talk about that tomorrow then. Oh yes, I do have a Patreon account if anyone's familiar with that website, patreon.com, and my account is called DavChat. Yes, well, I like the Washington Post, and the New York Times does have great investigative journalism, but they also have fluff pieces for Jared Kushner and the Trump presidency, mostly written by Maggie Haberman and Peter Baker, and people who, well, at least Maggie Haberman is definitely affiliated with a public relations firm because her mother is an executive for Rubenstein, which is the PR company that has Jared Kushner and his family as a major client. And Maggie Haberman has written pro-Trump articles, like covertly pro-Trump articles. And I say covertly because she takes Trump's word for it about his wealth. So she's reported Trump to be a billionaire over and over again in articles for the New York Post in previous decades. And they're friends. And he occasionally is rude about her and denounces her as being a hack on Twitter. But there's photos of them hugging. Well, yes, I'm glad you have some good press, but yeah, no, she by breaking scandals just helps cement her reputation for having very valuable access. No, Trump loves Maggie. She's great at both sizing it because by breaking the scandals, that just makes people keep reading her. So then they don't judge her as much when she writes fluff pieces about how great Jared is, because she's got so much credibility from the scandal she breaks. Trump's is media savvy enough to understand, like Madonna, that sometimes any publicity can be good publicity. So even if it's a scandal, it still keeps his top fluffer in her place, in a very influential place in the New York Times, which has so much influence because of its prestige. So no, I definitely despise Haberman because she's so much more dangerous. And your perception that it's overreaction is from your lack of acquaintance with her role in perverting the public's response to Trump for so many years, like decades of falsely reporting Trump to be a billionaire because he said so, without doing adequate work to establish what his worth is. She just has continually said Trump with his great wealth in a non-critical way in the New York Post, eventually getting a promotion to work for the New York Times, where she's like, oh yeah, Trump's bad, and reports breathlessly, the mood in the White House is this and this. But then you look at the pieces she writes about Jared Kushner, and you look at how she writes about people's hopes that this power couple will be a positive influence on the president. She helps keep people in a comfortable situation. She helps keep them concerned but interested, reading the saga of Trump as if it's just a soap opera rather than a critical, democracy-threatening liability. So I think I'm done talking to you about that. Thank you so much to everybody for listening, and I'll make sure I don't get stuck in a discussion with someone who doesn't really know that much about what they're talking about next time about the New York Times. Feel free to read more about it on your own. Google Maggie Haberman and the Rubenstein PR representative public relations firm and who their major clients are. Cheers. Bye, Bob. Take care, everybody. See you later. Bye.